Hello, I'm Alma Angeles. You're watching Eagle News International on tonight's headlines. The U.S. deployed several thousand troops to bolster NATO forces in Eastern Europe as the leaders of France and Germany flagged trips to Moscow to address Western fears of an invasion of Ukraine. New Zealand will start easing some of the world's toughest pandemic border restrictions this month, but will not fully reopen until October. President Duterte is currently observing mandatory quarantine protocols after exposure to a household staff who tested positive for COVID. A museum dedicated to NFTs, the blockchain-based creations that have taken the art world by storm, opened its doors in the U.S. The United States deployed several thousand troops to bolster NATO forces in Eastern Europe as the leaders of France and Germany flagged trips to Moscow to address Western fears of an invasion of Ukraine. First, let's listen in.
1,000 service members from the U.S. Army's 2nd Cavalry Regiment, which is based in Germany, will reposition to Romania in the coming days. Second, we are moving 1,700 service members from Fort Bragg to Poland and approximately 300 service members from Fort Bragg to Germany. These forces are separate and in addition to the 8,500 personnel in the United States on heightened alert position posture that we announced last week.
With Russia refusing to pull back 100,000 troops poised on Ukraine's borders, 1,000 U.S. soldiers in Germany are being sent to Romania. Another 2,000 stationed in the U.S. are being flown to Germany and Poland. Now, in response, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko said the move would make it harder for a compromise between the two sides, calling the U.S. deployments destructive steps which increase military tension and reduce scope for political decision. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced he would soon travel to Moscow to discuss the crisis, while France's President Emmanuel Macron said a similar trip may be in the cards, depending on upcoming talks with other world leaders. In Washington, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby stressed that the U.S. troop movements were to demonstrate commitment to the NATO alliance and that no American soldiers would be sent to fight in Ukraine, which is not a NATO member.
These forces are not going to fight in Ukraine. They're going to ensure the robust defense of our NATO allies. All of these forces are separate and in addition to the 8,500 personnel in the United States on heightened alert posture that I announced last week. Those 8,500 are not currently being deployed, but remain ready to move if called for the NATO response force or as needed for other contingencies as directed by the Secretary or by President Biden. It's important that we send a strong signal to Mr. Putin and, frankly, to the world that NATO matters to the United States. It matters to our allies. And we have ironclad Article 5 commitments.
But that is unlikely to assuage President Putin, who has accused the U.S. and NATO of seeking to contain Russia by placing troops and strategic arms on its border. Again, let's listen in.
Самое главное, их задача – сдерживание развития России. Вот в чем дело. В этом смысле сама Украина – это просто инструмент достижения этой цели. Это можно сделать разными путями, втянув нас в какой-то вооруженный конфликт.
President Putin has demanded guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO and has implicitly threatened the former Soviet state with a massive military buildup. Russia also wants NATO and the U.S. to forswear the deployment of missile systems near Russia's borders and to pull back NATO forces in Eastern Europe. Putin has left the door open to talk, saying he was studying Western proposals set out last month in response to Russia's demands, and that he hoped that in the end they will find a solution. Video footage released by Russian Defense Ministry showed tanks speeding across snowy fields in Belarus and combat helicopters flying overhead as units from both countries practiced ahead of the February 10 to 20 drills. NATO, meanwhile, welcomed the new U.S. troop deployment, with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying the alliance will do whatever is necessary to protect and defend all allies. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates on Wednesday said it prevented another drone attack over its territory after Washington said it will send a warship and fighter jets to help defend its Gulf ally as conflict with Yemeni rebels intensify. The UAE, a major financial hub and part of the Saudi-led coalition fighting Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels for 7 years, announced the interception and destruction of 3 hostile drones on Wednesday, the 4th similar attack targeting the wealthy state in 3 weeks. Take a look. Although the latest attack was not immediately claimed, it follows missile and drone assaults the Houthis said they carried out this year. 3 people have been killed. The U.S. Embassy in the UAE said the U.S. deployment to assist the UAE against the current threat follows a phone call between Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Under the arrangements, the guided missile destroyer, the USS Cole, will partner with the UAE Navy and make a port call in Abu Dhabi, while the U.S. will also deploy 5th-generation warplanes, which are the most advanced. In the rebel-held Yemeni capital Sana'a, a senior Houthi official, Sultan al-Sameh, dismissed the U.S. support. Take a look.
هذه القوات الجديدة التي وصلت إلى أو التي ستصل إلى الإمارات لا تخيفنا. لن نتوقف عما بدأناه من الدفاع عن أنفسنا، فالدفاع مشروع، ولن نتوقف إلا عندما يتوقف العدوان على بلادنا وتنسحب القوات المحسوبة على دولة أو دويلة الإمارات من المحافظات المحتلة.
The rebel attacks have increased Gulf tensions at a time when international talks over Iran's nuclear program are stumbling and have helped push oil prices to 7-year highs. They began after a series of defeats on the ground in Yemen, inflicted by the UAE-trained Giants Brigade's militia. Yemen's civil war began in 2014 when the Houthis seized the capital Sana'a, prompting Saudi-led forces to intervene in support of the internationally recognized government the following year. The UAE, one of the world's biggest arms buyers, announced a redeployment from Yemen in 2019, but remains an influential player. The UN calls Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with millions on the brink of famine. In other news, more than 50 civilians were killed when machete-wielding militiamen attacked a site for displaced people in strife-torn eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, according to sources. 52 people, some of them children, were killed, according to a source with the UN's peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, adding that 36 were wounded. The KST said the suspected attackers, carrying edge weapons, were from a notorious armed group called Codeco, blamed for a string of ethnic massacres in the area. Fighting between the two groups flared between 1999 and 2003, claiming tens of thousands of lives before being quelled by a European Union peacekeeping force, Artemis. Violence then resumed in 2017, blamed on the emergence of Codeco, the cooperative for the development of the Congo, which claims to defend the Lendu. The region is also struggling to contain the allied democratic forces, the most brutal of an estimated 122 armed groups that roam Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Meanwhile, the United Nations has increased its fundraising target for victims of Typhoon Rai or Odette to $169 million as the Philippines struggles to recover from the devastating storm. Humanitarians said the typhoon has only aggravated a situation that was already fragile due to the pandemic, generating a crisis within a crisis. Take a look.
Still have a long way. There was a 6-month appeal that had been issued, 107 million. This has now been revised upward to 169 million, just 7 weeks following the typhoon. And so far, 51 million has been received. So you can see we still have a long way to go. In this typhoon, because it hit such a vast area, the area as large as Austria, it made 9 landfalls within 2 days. So the extent of the damage, sort of surprisingly still coming out. We're still getting reports of more houses being damaged, more agricultural land being destroyed. And, indeed, there was 11 out of 17 of the country's regions that have been hit. This is happening amidst the pandemic, which is really a calamity within a crisis. We're seeing it, of course, amongst communities that are being affected, people living in close quarters and evacuation centers. And of course, even our own humanitarian workers. I had 5 emergency experts come in from abroad, and all 5 of them have gone down with COVID. And so many of us are struggling, as well as the government, to have sufficient staff to respond to the crisis.
Rai, locally named Odette, the strongest typhoon to hit the Philippines last year, intensified faster than expected according to officials. And scientists have long warned that typhoons are strengthening more rapidly as the world becomes warmer because of human-driven climate change. The Philippines, ranked among the most vulnerable nations to its impacts, is hit by an average of 20 storms every year. In 2013, to recall, Typhoon Haiyan was the strongest storm ever to have made landfall, leaving over 7,300 people dead or missing. Cabinet Secretary Carlo Nograles, acting presidential spokesperson as well, said that President Duterte is currently observing mandatory quarantine protocols after exposure to a household staff who tested positive for COVID. Nograles said the president has since been tested for COVID-19, and while the results of the test came back negative, he's currently observing mandatory quarantine protocols. Nograles said Duterte's last day of exposure to a COVID-19 positive case was last January 30. His RT-PCR, or reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction, negative test result was last Monday, January 31st, and tested negative again for the second time on Tuesday, February 1. Nograles said the president is still in constant communication with cabinet members to ensure that urgent matters are addressed while in quarantine. In a separate message to reporters, former Chief Presidential Legal Advisor Salvador Panelo said the president is busy with paperwork in the Bahay ng Pagbabago in Malacanang. Meanwhile, staying in the country, the Philippines coronavirus risk classification is down from high and critical to moderate, according to the Department of Health. On Wednesday, take a look.
In NCR, nakita na natin yung patuloy na pagbaba. Nakita rin natin yung utilization natin sa ating mga ospital dito, yung mga admissions, no, slowly ay nababawasan na. Nasa moderate risk tayo ngayon sa NCR. That's why we were able to de-escalate to alert level 2. Makikita natin yung patuloy, no, na pagbaba ng mga kaso sa regions 3, 4A, NCR. But we are also seeing the other regions na nung tumataas ang kanilang mga kaso, no? But if we look at the trends in the number of cases, especially the 7-day moving average, nagpa-plateau na, no? In Visayas, bumabagal na yung pagtaas ng kaso sa kanila. Hindi na masyadong nag-uptick yung mga numero ng kaso. Sa Mindanao, may mga piling lugar, katulad ng Caraga at saka Region 12, kung saan medyo nagkakaroon ng pagtaas ang pag-utilize ng kanilang mga kama. No? Like in Region 12 and Caraga, meron silang about 72% utilization of their beds for COVID. So binabantayan natin maigi to. But as I've said, other than that, NCR, areas outside of NCR plus, pati ang Visayas ay nakikita na natin ang mabagal, no? Katulad sa Visayas, may slow decline na sila ng mga numero ng mga kaso.
The pilot vaccination of children aged 5 to 11 years old against COVID-19 will be reset from the original February 4 to be scheduled on February 7 due to logistical challenges. The announcement was made through a joint statement of the Department of Health, the National Task Force Against COVID-19, and the National Vaccination Operations Center released on Thursday. The NTF said there's a slight delay in the delivery of the FDA-approved COVID vaccines allocated for this age group. The initial shipment of the reformulated low-dosing Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccines is expected to arrive Friday evening, causing the postponement of the pilot run. In the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control said it's too early to lift some COVID restrictions given the high rate of hospitalization and deaths there. Let's listen in.
And with the mixed news above, similar to other waves during the pandemic, our data continue to reinforce the critical importance of vaccination. Last week, I shared data so with that barometer, we've said before, Omicron milder does not mean mild. And so we really do have to look to our hospitalization rates and our death rates to look to when is time to lift some of these mitigation efforts. We will continue to reevaluate, and we know people are anxious.
Meanwhile, New Zealand will start easing some of the world's toughest pandemic border restrictions this month, but will not fully reopen until October. That, according to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern today. The Prime Minister announced a 5-step plan to reconnect New Zealand to the rest of the world, beginning with waiving hotel quarantine requirements for its nationals stranded overseas by the pandemic and more. Let's listen in.
Today I'm announcing that the fully vaccinated Kiwis and other currently eligible travellers from Australia will be able to travel to New Zealand from 11:59 p.m. Sunday, 27 February. And instead of going into MIQ, we'll be able to self-isolate. So this is a very important milestone for New Zealand. But let me emphasise, it is a milestone we are ready for. We have two categories of tourists in New Zealand, those that can come visa-free and those that require a visa. So tourists from visa-free countries, of which there are a large number, they can start coming from July. Those who require a visa will be, we anticipate, October. Families and friends need to reunite. Our businesses need skills to grow. Exporters need to travel to make new connections. It's time to move again.
Ardern said the quarantine system, known locally as MIQ, had been a key part of New Zealand's success containing the coronavirus, with only 53 deaths recorded in a population of 5 million. New Zealand initially planned to start easing border controls last month and fully reopen in April, but delayed the move as the Omicron variant emerged. Ardern said New Zealand's high vaccination rate, almost 95% of the population is double jabbed, with a third also receiving a booster, meant change was now possible. Meanwhile, to Canada now, where Quebec has backtracked on its plans to impose taxes on the unvaccinated people. They finally gave in after mounting opposition to the controversial measure. Here's Marjorie Quintos for the report.
The Quebec government has done an about-face and decided against taxing the unvaccinated. Premier François Legault decided to abandon the so-called health contributions for the unvaccinated, saying discontent grows day by day. When first proposed in January, it provoked strong reactions in the French-speaking Canadian province of Quebec. Legault says he won't proceed with the measure so that Quebec can move forward in a serene social climate. This tax was intended as an incentive to convince the unvaccinated to get immunized against COVID-19. But Legault now believes that the proposal has divided Quebecers. Quebec government also announced Tuesday that sports and artistic activities for adults will be able to resume from February 14th up to a maximum of 25 people. That also means that gyms and spas will be able to reopen at 50% of their capacity. After an unexpected closure New Year's Eve, restaurants reopened on this past Monday and extracurricular sports activities resumed. 9 out of 10 Quebecers have received 2 doses of the coronavirus vaccine and 61% have received a booster dose. For Eagle News in Montreal, Quebec, this is Marjorie Quintos. We live in interesting times.
Staying in Canada, most protesters who recently packed the streets of Canada's capital and jarred locals with loud honking trucks have left. But the stragglers are determined and volatile, according to police warning this today. Around 15,000 rowdy protesters opposed to Canada's COVID vaccine mandate and other public health measures converge on Ottawa's downtown over the weekend, according to a police estimate, bringing the city to a virtual standstill. While their numbers dwindled midweek, they are expected to surge again, possibly into the thousands this weekend, as well as spread to other parts of the country. The capital's police chief, Peter Slawley, suggested the Canadian military may need to be called in to help clear them. Slowly noted that Canada has only called in the military twice in its history to quell domestic unrest in a standoff with Indigenous protesters in 1990 and after a Quebec politician and a British diplomat were kidnapped by a militant Quebec separatist group back in 1970. Quebec Deputy Premier Pierre Laporte, was strangled to death by his captors then. Crowd limits at cultural and sports events will be lifted in Finland from February 14, according to the Prime Minister, with most remaining coronavirus controls to end on March 1. The government will issue advice to local authorities to make events, culture, and sports possible in all their forms from February 14, according to Prime Minister Sanna Marin after cabinet discussions on the country's strategy. In addition, Marin said restaurants and bars, which must currently end alcohol sales at 8 p.m. will be able to serve alcohol until 11 from mid-February, but nightclubs will remain closed until the start of March. Denmark on Tuesday became the first EU nation to scrap nearly all remaining restrictions. Meanwhile, Sweden said it would lift most of its coronavirus restrictions on February 9 as the pandemic enters a whole new phase with a highly contagious but milder Omicron variant. Among the domestic restrictions that will be lifted are the 11 p.m. closing for bars and restaurants and limits on crowd members. Vaccine passes for indoor events will no longer be required. Face masks will no longer be recommended on public transport at peak times. A return to working in person will resume gradually, as will university and higher education classes. However, authorities recommended that people continue to stay home if they have COVID symptoms, and border restrictions will remain in place for the time being. Unvaccinated people are meanwhile advised to continue avoiding crowds after February 9. Sweden made headlines early in the pandemic for choosing not to impose lockdowns. And Germany today recommended a fourth coronavirus vaccine for at-risk groups following in the footsteps of Israel and several European countries. Germany's STIKO Vaccine Commission said a top-up shot for the most vulnerable was necessary after recent data showed that protection against the currently circulating Omicron variant wanes within a few months of the first booster vaccination. Now, the fourth jab should be given to people over 70 and anyone over the age of 5 with a weakened immune system, according to STIKO, as well as to those working in medical and care facilities to limit the impact of quarantine and illness on staffing. Germany only uses the mRNA vaccines made by BioNTech, Pfizer, or Moderna as top-up jabs. STIKO recommended at least a 3-month gap between the two booster doses for high-risk groups and 6 months for healthcare workers and carers. The expert body doesn't recommend a fourth dose for those who caught the virus after their third shot. To the U.S. now, a study found that COVID vaccination doesn't negatively impact couples trying to conceive, and it does not affect fertility. Here's Dr. Anthony Fauci, Chief Medical Advisor to President Biden. Take a look.
That there's no evidence. Next slide. The data are clear. COVID-19 vaccination in male or female partners did not affect the likelihood of conception. Couples were 18% less likely to conceive if the male partner had been infected with SARS-CoV-2 within 60 days before a menstrual cycle. That is infected, not vaccinated. However, COVID-19 disease only temporarily reduced male fertility. New data add to previous studies that indicate that COVID-19 vaccination does not negatively impact fertility. CDC and professional medical organizations serving people of reproductive age emphasize, as shown on this website, that there's no evidence that vaccination impairs fertility. And of course, as we've all said over and over again, vaccination is recommended for people who are trying to get pregnant now or might become pregnant in the future, as well as their partners. And anyone who's vaccinated and pregnant, breastfeeding, trying to get pregnant now, or might become pregnant in the future, should also get a booster shot when eligible.
And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. Mailalabas natin ang aking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Welcome back. Top oil-producing countries led by Saudi Arabia and Russia announced another modest increase in output despite soaring crude prices and geopolitical tensions battling the markets. The 23-nation OPEC Plus group said in a statement that it will increase production by 400,000 barrels a day in March, the same amount as in previous months. The group has resisted U.S. pressure to further boost production to tame prices. Oil prices hit 7-year highs in January, with the main international crude contract, Brent, topping $90 per barrel. Prices are now hovering under 90. The market has been further boosted by soaring geopolitical tensions plaguing stalwarts of oil production, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The UAE on Monday intercepted another ballistic missile launched by Yemen's Houthi rebels, the latest attack on the Gulf country, which is part of a Saudi-led military coalition. While in Europe, tensions between Moscow and Western allies are at their highest point since the Cold War, after Russia massed troops on its border with Ukraine. Major oil terminals in some of the Western Europe's biggest ports have fallen victim to a cyber attack. According to sources confirming this Thursday, Belgian prosecutors have launched an investigation into the hacking of oil facilities in the country's ports, including Antwerp's, Europe's second biggest port after Rotterdam. One of the main victims seems to be the Amsterdam-Rotterdam-Antwerp oil trading hub, where company IT systems were affected by the attack. Sea Tank Terminal, which has storage facilities in Antwerp, was also affected by a cyber attack. According to a specialized broker, the alleged hacking is affecting several European ports. It's also disrupting the unloading of barges in an already strained oil market. And more oil news. Shell swung back into massive profit last year. The energy giant revealed Thursday as oil and gas prices rocketed on recovering demand and geopolitical unrest. Shell said in a statement that net profit stood at $20.1 billion after a loss after tax of $21.7 billion in 2020 as economies reopened from pandemic lockdowns. Following the bumper earnings, Shell said it planned a share buyback program totaling $8.5 billion. As lockdown spread in 2020, oil prices dropped off a cliff, even briefly turning negative. Prices have since rebounded sharply, with the benchmark Brent North Sea oil contract trading at almost $90 a barrel. An international coalition of travel-related organizations called on the U.S. government to stop requiring vaccinated passengers to present a negative COVID test before boarding U.S.-bound flights. Travel and aviation's recovery is dependent on the government taking steps to remove these travel restrictions that are no longer justified by current circumstances, according to the group. They argued this in a letter addressed to the White House Coronavirus Response Coordinator, Jeffrey Zients. Among the 29 signatories were the main advocacy organizations representing Asian, European, and U.S. airlines, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the U.S. Travel Association. Midfielder Cho So-yoon's fourth-minute goal helped ease South Korea to a comfortable 2-0 victory over the Philippines and enter their first Women's Asian Final Cup in India today. Now, Son Hwa-yeon doubled the lead in the 34th minute. And South Korea, who beat Australia 1-0 in the quarterfinals, dominated the game with 80% possession in the first half. The Philippines forward line breached the opposition defense a few times, but 9 of their shots were off target. Now, the COVID-hit tournament hosted in Pune saw hosts India bow out after they were unable to field the team for their second match against Taiwan last month when several players tested positive. Korea will now face the winners of the second semi-final between 8-time champions China and title holders Japan to be played later today. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic has left Europe's clubs with a massive €7 billion crater in their bank accounts, according to a UEFA report concluding this today. The virus disrupted past 2 seasons with many games played to empty terraces and did an uninterrupted rise in revenue over the previous 20 years. With gate receipts decimated, sponsorship down, and television rights receipts hit, clubs suffered a €4 billion hit in 2019-2020 and the $3 billion in 2020 to 2021. Lockdowns imposed to curb the spread of the virus that has killed nearly 2 million in Europe and 5.69 million worldwide cut off the club's financial lifeblood, the fans. And the Beijing Olympics will change the scale of Winter Olympics forever. That is Winter Sports forever. That is according to IOC President Thomas Bach. On the eve of a games beset by concerns about human rights and COVID, China's ruling Communist Party hopes the Olympics will be a soft power triumph, but they've been overshadowed by diplomatic boycotts, fears for tennis player Peng Shuai, warnings about surveillance, and the environmental impact. Let's listen in.
值此中国新春佳节之际，很高兴同大家相聚双奥之城北京。现在我宣布，国际奥委会第139次全会开幕。
Beijing will become the first city ever to host both summer and winter editions of the Olympic Games. China has already made history by surpassing the goal of engaging 300 million Chinese people with sport on snow and ice. Today, we can say China is a winter sport country. It will change the landscape of winter sport around the world forever.
非常骄傲啊，因为可以成为一个双奥的火炬手。谢谢奥组委给我这个机会。家门口那有一个不同的感觉，可以代表国家，把这个火力传递出去，把这个爱心和平传给全世界，也在这个长城让更多人看见我们中国的文化。
Now, that was Jackie Chan. A day before the official start of the Beijing Games, the Winter Olympic torch relay was taken along the Great Wall of China. And as we saw there, Hong Kong actor Jackie Chan joined the Chinese Olympic medalists China, where the virus emerged in late 2019, has pursued a no-nonsense zero-COVID policy nationwide and adopted the same approach to the games, with everyone cocooned inside the bubble, having daily tests and required to wear a mask at all times. There were 55 positive COVID results among games-related personnel on Wednesday, the highest daily so far, bringing the number since January 23 to 287. China barred overseas fans because of the pandemic, but some spectators will be invited to attend, and organizers say venues could still be up to 50% full. And the International Children's Exhibition of Fine Arts, Lidice, is calling on all children and teachers all over the world to join the competition. Here's Arlene Ocampo for the details. Arlene.
Calling all teachers and children. The Embassy of the Czech Republic invites you to be part of the 50th International Children's Exhibition of Fine Arts Lidice 2022. Established in 1967, the project honors child victims from the Czech village of Lidice, annihilated by German Nazis in 1942, as well as all other children who have died in wars. One of the largest children's art competitions in the world, it is open to all organizations and schools with children from 4 to 16 years of age. The artworks will be awarded Rose of Lidice medals and honorable mentions and will be displayed at the Lidice Gallery. Every year, a theme is chosen by the Lidice Memorial in collaboration with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO. This year, the theme is Museum, highlighting the world's diversity and shared history in museums. Artworks can be created using different media such as film, animation, drawing, painting, and photography. Inspirations can be derived from a variety of things: museum exhibits such as famous artworks, botanical gardens, or even creating a museum of your dreams. Creativity is key here. Deadline of artwork submissions is February 11, 2022. Check out www.mzv.cz for more information. Stay tuned to Eagle News for more from the nation's capital. Arlene Ocampo, Embassy Files, Eagle News.
And a museum dedicated to NFTs, the blockchain-based creations that have taken the art world by storm, opened its doors last week in Seattle, Washington State. Again, let's listen in.
NFTs are very new, which is why we wanted to be able to have a museum located right in the middle of downtown so that NFTs are a little bit more approachable.
The point of a physical space is to make it easier for anyone to access. You can walk in here, and depending on how much you know or don't know about digital art, about NFTs, it doesn't really matter, because you can see the art in a large format display in a way that would remind you or be familiar of a museum exhibition.
People in my networks are absolutely starting to get into NFTs and just digital currency in general. I think like last year I didn't even know what a Dogecoin or a Shiba Inu was. So just there's a lot more awareness, especially in Seattle.
It's also interesting how many people are in there kind of checking it out too. It's kind of a global phenomenon, so we're kind of watching it come to life.
As always, I'll end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is proof that God's plan is to keep us moving forward. This has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angeles. Stay alert and stay informed because we live in interesting times. Good night.
Napapansin ba ninyo?